separa você do seu futuro? É o movimento do relógio ou a soma dos instantes vividos? Seja como for, o futuro sempre chega, mas pode não ser como se espera. Então, que tal viver cada momento? Comece agora, abrace o presente e siga em frente. A vida é feita de começos e recomeços. E até quando tudo parece impossível, é possível viver do seu jeito. Então viva! Curta quem está ao seu lado, mesmo distante. Arrume sua casa e se arrume para você. Compartilhe as alegrias, aprenda com seus erros, sem medo de experimentar. Afinal, não existe manual nem regras. Cada segundo é uma história que você escreve. Ou não, a escolha é sua. Mas não se esqueça, a vida é pra já. E seu coração bate para lembrar que ela corre em você. Então viva! Viva você!
Olá a todos e a todas, eu me chamo Carolina Cavanha, sou gerente de assuntos corporativos na Biogen, que é um laboratório farmacêutico com foco em neurociência. Bom, em nome da Biogen, eu gostaria de agradecer a todos vocês que se juntaram aqui nesses dias para discutir um tema tão importante, longevidade, num país como o nosso, de dimensão continental, marcado por desigualdade, com um sistema público de saúde, com um forte sistema de seguridade social, discutir o envelhecimento saudável. E todas as frentes, né, que fazem parte desse tema é muito mais do que bem-vindo, certo? Então, num país com envelhecimento rápido e com muitos desafios que a gente tem que superar juntos enquanto coletivo, esse tipo de fórum se faz central. Então, em nome da Biogen, eu gostaria de agradecer, é um prazer poder contribuir de alguma forma com todos e desejar um ótimo evento, uma ótima discussão, que saímos daqui mais sábios, com mais vontade de fazer coisa diferente e com claro compromisso social das coisas, certo? Muito obrigada pela oportunidade e ótimo evento.
A Academia Nacional de Medicina se sente muito honrada em poder apoiar e participar do Fórum Internacional de Longevidade com a coordenação do grande professor Kalash. Sem dúvida, desnecessário dizer, a importância de simpósios assim para trazer o melhor da medicina para toda a sociedade brasileira, através também da preparação adequada de um grande número de profissionais de saúde. A perspectiva internacional sob a liderança do professor Kalash é muito importante ser mantida, preservada e elogiada. Parabéns.
Em nome da Sociedade Brasileira de Geriatria e Gerontologia Rio de Janeiro, eu quero dar as boas-vindas a você ao Fórum Internacional de Longevidade. Estamos aqui hoje e nas próximas semanas com uma programação muito criativa, elaborada pelo grão-mestre Dr. Alexandre Kalash, do ILC Brasil, para discutir temáticas relevantes no âmbito da longevidade no Brasil e no mundo. Eu espero que nós tenhamos daqui a 2 semanas a oportunidade de falar também sobre algumas gratas surpresas que serão lançadas nesse evento. Venham comigo e aproveitem o fórum.
Olá, boa noite. Eu sou Alexandre Kalash, sou presidente do Centro Internacional da Longevidade Brasil, que organiza esse simpósio, esse tradicional fórum. Já estamos na 9ª edição, com o apoio fantástico da Bradesco Seguros e também com a Biogen, a Academia Nacional de Medicina e a Sociedade Brasileira de Geriatria e Gerontologia. Eu vou passar para o inglês agora, para já entrar no espírito do que nós vamos apresentar hoje. Nós hoje vamos ter uma sessão conjunta com o ILC do Reino Unido. We are going to have a joint session with the ILC United Kingdom. The Future of Aging 2021. Reimagining Aging in a Changing World. The pandemic has brought to the fore the fact that there is no such a thing as a typical older person. We won't always spend our retirement on cruises and holidays, and most of us will neither be living in a care home nor spending the kids' inheritance, if there is any. In fact, our aging society is increasingly diverse in terms of the characteristics, experience of life and trajectories of the older people of today and tomorrow. We want our response to longevity to be informed by this reality. We want a society that works for everyone, regardless of their age, but also regardless of their gender, their ethnicity, their sexual identity, their abilities, or their beliefs. In light of the dramatic changes and challenges we have all faced over the past couple of years with the pandemic, we need to look afresh and plan for a new reality. Today, we want to explore how government, business, and individuals need to plan for the future of aging and how we instill fresh thinking into well-worn debates. We want to recalibrate and reimagine aging in light of new norms around what it is like to age. So we are going to have 4 sessions that have already taken place at the event this afternoon in the ILC-UK, and I will make comments. We are not going to show the whole event because it took 8 hours since early morning till the end of the afternoon, but we have selected specific sessions so that we can think about the main aspects and main messages of this very important annual meeting of ILC United Kingdom. So let us start with the first session, which is a session that is recalibrating aging. What does the future of aging look like? And it was chaired by Diane Kenwood, who is a member of ILC-UK here in the United Kingdom. We had as speakers Nancy Kelly, Kate Joplin, Sophia Glenthorhouse, and Marianne Wage. They will be introduced by the chair of this specific session. Let us get to the video.
Hello, welcome back from your break. Thank you for joining us again for this next session. I'm Diane Kenwood. I'm one of the trustees of the International Longevity Centre. I'm going to keep my introduction really short because we have a fantastic panel of speakers and I want to make sure they get as much airtime as possible. But I just wanted to set up this session by saying that our images of later life and an ageing population still tend to be pretty much homogenous, with maybe the accidental or unconscious bias that John Penrose referred to earlier playing a part in limiting our perceptions and views. There's a saying, isn't there? If you've met one older person, you've met one older person. And that is even more pertinent when it comes to inclusivity and diversity, which is the theme of this session. So I would please encourage you to put your questions up on Slido so that we have a really lively conversation after each of our presenters has said their piece. And do join in on social media using the hashtag Future of Aging. So I'll quickly introduce each of our panel members. I'm going to have to stop pretending I can see this without my glasses. Here on the stage with us, we have Nancy Kelly, who is the Chief Executive of Stonewall, the LGBTQ+ human rights organisation. Next to her is Lydia Best, who's the President of the European Federation of Hard of Hearing People. And alongside her, Kate Joplin, who's policy and political strategy consultant and a former director of programmes at the ILC. Joining us remotely, and it's lovely to see you, is Sophia Clithanus. I knew I was going to trip up over that. Sorry about that, Sophia. Who's a disability campaigner and campaigns manager at the Chartered Insurance Institute. And the empty chair is for Barbara Burton, who's stuck on a train at the moment, but she's the founder of a fantastic organisation called Behind Bars, which helps women transition from prison to meaningful employment. So you can see what I mean about a fantastic panel. And without further ado, I will ask Nancy to come up and talk to you.
I'm not even going to start by pretending that I can read anymore without my glasses. So my name's Nancy, I'm the Chief Exec of Stonewall. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm going to just talk briefly to you about what we know about LGBTQ plus people as we get older. So I thought I'd start by thinking about and encouraging everybody here to think about some of the really positive things we bring in to the world as we age. LGBTQ plus people like me, we've got a breadth of life experiences, and those life experiences traverse things that are in and outside of social norms. We're very unique. Our elders have often travelled incredibly unique paths through their lives. We often bring an ability to reinvent ourselves, to reinvent the world around us, because we've had to do those things. We bring a talent for building relationships, for building community with other people, for building families. And I might return a bit to the idea of chosen families later in the conversation. And we bring a bucket full of resilience. Most of us have had to be quite resilient. LGBTQ plus elders in particular have had to be resilient. But we also bring with us some vulnerabilities that are the legacy of living in a homophobic, biphobic and transphobic society. And as we age, we can become more, not less, vulnerable to homophobia, biphobia and transphobia. So I'm just going to point to some of what we know about that. So if we think about the area of health, we know that LGBTQ plus elders, people over 50, have poorer self-rated health and are more likely than cis and straight peers to have conditions that impact on health and well-being. We're more likely to engage in some specific harmful health behaviours, so using drugs, drinking more than is healthy, smoking. We're also more likely to exercise. It's actually gay men that are more likely to exercise, in case you're wondering. Lesbians like me sit on the sofa. Although I am obviously very healthy, she lied. We have real difficulties accessing healthcare that meets our needs and can kind of appropriately deal with our identities. So there's one study that found that 18% of our elders feel uncomfortable even disclosing their sexual orientation to a GP. And if you think about the health-related consequences of that, they're fairly significant. And our past experiences of having quite negative experience with healthcare provider really shapes the way that we engage with health services into our later life. Really critically in terms of mental health, and perhaps one of the biggest health gaps for my community as a whole, is the fact that LGBTQ plus people across our life course have twice the rate of common mental disorders, to use the medical language. We have twice the rate of mental health problems of cis and straight peers. And that's true of teenagers, and it's true of middle-aged people, and it's true of our elders. There is an enormously under-researched and under-invested in issue around LGBTQ plus mental health, and we know that that continues right into our older population. So our elders have quite acute risk, including around suicide, particularly when we think about groups like trans elders and bisexual people as they age. Actually, it's probably people often mistakenly think that bi people have better outcomes than lesbian and gay people. That's not true. This is my gift to you. They have much worse mental health outcomes in particular. When we think about social care, we are not able to avoid homophobia or biphobia or transphobia in care settings because we've kind of lost autonomy. We are where we are. Many of you read the EHRC study, and some of the stories from that are really striking. So one older trans woman described being stared at like a freak, she said, by her home care worker, and sometimes just sitting there weeping after they'd left. In that study, you also hear an older gay man with dementia who decided to stop having any services because of the reaction of care staff. So he had to go into residential care earlier than necessary because his partner couldn't cope with the caring responsibilities. And in that same EHRC study, what you see is a lot of care providers viewed gender identity and sexual orientation as kind of not relevant. It's just a personal issue. We don't need to know about it. You should think about social isolation in particular for our community. So LGBTQ plus people over 50 are much more likely to be single, right? So gay and bisexual men, for instance, are almost 3 times more likely to be single than straight men. We're much more likely to live alone. About 41% of us live alone compared to 28% of straight people. We're less likely to have children. And if we think about the way in which kind of our understanding of aging relies on family members, you might need to think much more about chosen family for my community. Less than a quarter of us see our biological family regularly. And creating new social or romantic relationships as we age is really, really difficult. There are very few LGBTQ plus specific spaces for elders, and commercial venues can be really, really age phobic. So all of this means is some of us don't have anyone to turn to. There's a study that shows 1 in 12 older LGBTQ plus people don't have anyone to turn to for emotional support. And we can be unsafe even in our own homes. So a study by Stonewall Housing and Opening Doors talked about trans participants who weren't safe even in their own communal areas of their properties. So what does that all mean? It means we've got an enormous amount to offer society as we age. We've got this creativity, this resilience, this community building power. And the whole community can benefit from those things. But we also have a lot to fear from society. And in fact, our declining autonomy leaves us very vulnerable to homophobia, biphobia and transphobia. And I'll leave you with the idea that for some of us, it brings us back full circle to being as vulnerable as we were as teenagers living in an unsafe family or an unsafe community. So I'll pass on to my next colleague, but that's some food for thought.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nancy. Now, Lydia, if you'd like to take the stage.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you to organizers for inviting me today, and thank you for a really nice introduction. I am not only the president of the European Federation of Hard of Hearing People, but also a chair of National Association of People in the UK. And here is for you to just a little bit snapshot of what the Association of Deaf People is. As a charity, we were founded in 1984 because the group of people who were definite and active politically and socially, one felt that the needs were not partly catered by the existing organizations at the time. And I will explain why this was the reason. We provide support. So we are a proud member of the World Health Organization specific group, which is called World Hearing Fórum, bringing all stakeholders, professionals, civil society, persons with disabilities together to change the way we look at hearing loss. So to start with, Diane asked me to talk about the terminology, to talk about what does that mean, deaf, hard of hearing, deafened? Well, actually, there are 2 distinct groups between the people with hearing loss. One is generally deaf, meaning people who are profoundly deaf or with severe hearing loss, often from birth, and use sign language as the preferred language of communication or receiving information. And the deaf community is bound by shared language, which is sign language. Whereas hard of hearing people, there are people who have lost their hearing partially to different degrees, and whose usual means of communication is by speech, as I do now. And it includes also those who become totally deaf, as I am, actually. After acquisition of speech, I am deafened. I now wear cochlear implant. For many years, I just wore hearing aids. And this brings us to explaining that the functionality of those two different groups is completely different. Today I'm using actually speech-to-text, which is provided, thank you to organizers, to make sure that I can follow the conversations going on here. I don't use the sign language. So the society still sees deaf means everybody must be using sign language. It's not true. And it is generally understood 1 in 7 is a person who in the society who has hearing loss. So according to the World Health Organization, 466 million have disabling hearing loss, meaning they really need hearing aids to be able to continue communicating and socializing with others. Approximately of them, 1/3 are the people over 60 years of age who are affected by that hearing loss. So that is important topic. And also one of the main impacts of hearing loss is what I have mentioned earlier, ability to communicate with others. So I wanted to make the presentation because I wanted to throw it out, a visual way of looking at the hearing loss and how we are seeing it. And I'd like to reimagine the way we see hearing loss, aging, and disability altogether, because they are really conspiring together. The adverts sometimes we see in the newspapers, hearing aids can be ugly. Does that help me or anybody else, especially older person? No. Ours are invisible. Some people are conscious. They don't want to show the hearing aids. That is true. Then you've got another advert or photographs showing older person with a really ugly hearing aid. That is not something you want to wear. Then I'm bringing you to Basil 40, if you remember 40 Towers, and this moment of a woman coming with a hearing aid, the old-fashioned one, and the fun he was making of her, pretending that he doesn't hear what she's saying. She was turning up her, hearing aid and didn't realize they were actually pretending, and when they shouted and stuff, I can't make it. And then there's another one, which is, I am hard of hearing. I am ignoring you. This is, in general, the way sometimes society, people we live with, work with, see us. We are ignoring them. Honestly, I am not ignoring anyone. My brain does. I'm listening to my brain, and my brain is making selective hearing of who it understands quicker and better. If somebody has a high pitching voice, I will turn quickly if this person calls me. But somebody with soft-spoken voice, I will not. I'm not ignoring them. I am really hard of hearing. So there are often some kind of language also around hearing loss is harmful. Often if you do not respond to something because somebody was calling you or saying something to you, usually one of the first things you will hear is, are you deaf or what? The question is what the what is. Stupid? Dumb? It's really putting you right in the corner and making you this small immediately. I just cannot hear you. That's this all. So ambiguity of everyday ageism and negative age stereotypes does contribute to the stigma around the hearing loss, and that does not help with doing something about it when you come to older age. The stigma is often related, of course, to those visible characteristics like hearing aids, and the negative representation does reinforce stigma. Are you deaf or what? And negative language as well. Often, oh, you are deaf and dumb. I have heard in some places people still use the word, oh, this person is deaf and dumb. Hold on a second. You cannot use this kind of word. So I would like to even add, in addition to this, in the UK, hearing aids are free on the NHS. They may not be perfect for everyone, but they are. And yet many people are not aware of it. I have heard someone claiming nearly 50% of people who could use hearing aids don't even know about it. And 5% of those who could benefit from cochlear implants, something like as you use, only have 5% of people to receive it. That is an extremely low number, and it impacts on our later life and independence. So let's reimagine that aging and hearing loss. Let's start looking at the hearing loss in the same way as we see our monkeys. Have you checked your eyes? Have you checked your teeth? What about hearing being checked? Just such a normal thing. Just check your hearing. Make sure you are hearing well and functioning well. Hearing aids are not as ugly, as you can see. And then an older man with cochlear implant finally able to communicate and spend time with his grandchildren. Before, without cochlear implant, he wouldn't be able to do so. And then World Health Organization as well is constantly bringing those messages to reimagine the hearing loss, reimagine the way we are seeing. So building awareness among all of the adults and primary healthcare is important to make sure there are routine health hearing checks, available interventions with technology, rehabilitation, communication, but also accessibility is vital. Today, I have accessibility. It's not always available. The WHO recommends hearing screening for adults over the age of 55. And yet, we see a lot of resistance across the country as well as the world. And it's critical that we focus not just on the clinical hearing care, which is hearing aids, but also just general environment, which is inclusive for everyone. Because you would not believe it, but 41% in various surveys which we have had conducted retire early due to the impact of hearing loss and struggles in communication. It's a huge loss. They can contribute a lot. So to close down the discussion is we need to also close down inclusion and employment gap. Because of people who retire early, we should stop this happening. So if we are here, anybody in the audience who are responsible for equality, diversity and inclusion in your workplace, in your charity, in your care home organization, please make sure you include disability inclusion as well. Most of the time, it's completely forgotten. And then bring the reasonable adjustments to it. Make general access as well. And also take a look at the report published from the NHS, What Works. It is aimed on employers, but actually everybody can actually have a lot of pointers from that. Unfortunately, when it comes to the volunteering, we are not supported here. But remember, the retirement age is increasing. We are working longer, but our hearing loss is not just an issue for older people anymore. Lots of younger people lose their hearing, so it matters to us all. So don't let hearing loss limit us. Join us to raise awareness of hearing loss, which we do for the third year next year in the Parliament on the 3rd of March for the World Hearing Day. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Lydia. Sophia, I hope you are... Oh, there you are. Wonderful. It's lovely to have you joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Diane. I just sort of wanted to start to give you a bit of an introduction of who I am. So my name is Sophia Cleanthus, and I'm a disabled rights campaigner, known as the chronic campaigner in my community. I am disabled and have a number of chronic illnesses. Last year, the way disabled people were being mistreated by the government and the general public, I started a campaign group called Ableism and Me, and a photo campaign called Disabled And, which aims to share disabled people and show you what they really look like and how diverse and talented our community is. Next year, I'll be creating a website where people can upload their experiences of daily ableism and challenging the current PIP situation and trying to push for reform. I just want to talk about a couple of things before I present a poem that I've written around this area of ageism and ableism. So there are two kind of big models around disability that we kind of look at when we're looking at theory. One is called the medical model, which essentially says that disability is as a result of a physical condition. It looks at things like trying to cure us or saying that there's a way to be fixed. Whereas the social model looks at how society is actually the barrier, and that is what disables us. So most people who are disabled and most disabled writers and people that work in the field use the social model as a way of kind of really engaging with that topic area. It's important to note that 46% of older people, those aged over 60, have disabilities in the world, and that's more than 250 million older people experiencing moderate to severe disability. 4 million disabled people are living in poverty in the UK, and 1 billion live with a disability in the world. Before I start the poem, I just want to explain two words that you might not have heard, or you might not heard in this context. So ableism is the discrimination in favour of able-bodied or non-disabled people, and ageism is stereotyping and or discriminating against individuals or groups on the basis of their age. I'm going to read a spoken word poem now to express the kind of issues around ageism and ableism and what we can do to help. When I go outside with my walking stick in hand, or the next day my dynamic disability allows me to stand, strangers tut and stare at me and say I should be ashamed. Because a young woman can't be disabled. I hear it every day. We associate a walking stick with ageing and frailty, that a bad back or arthritis is only a concern in our 60s, and a hearing aid is only necessary once we move into our 50s. But disability can happen at any age. We are not a worst case scenario or to be pitied. Government cuts and 4 million in poverty, that should be scrutinised, and we should not be infantilised. Ageism assumes I don't need a priority seat on the bus. Ableism assumes I'm lying and making such a fuss. Ageism and ableism have always been linked. But at least you aren't disabled. At least you aren't old. Is that what we really think? But this fragmented thinking is driving stigma in both communities. We need to retire this outdated thinking and start a real debate that Alzheimer's is a disability and not a natural part of aging or a normal state. I have arthritis, but ageism means I still don't have a diagnosis because we relate it to age only. If this is the future of aging, it's a terrible prognosis. A lot of aging research is focused on white people, but on the contrary, research shows that older black people are living in higher levels of poverty. When COVID-19 hit South Asian and black families the most, we showed how much we cared, lumped together as BAME instead and said, ah well, almost. BAME, Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. It's racism and we must dismantle this application. We keep othering the most at-risk older groups, and this will continue their isolation. Saying they're unreachable, but it's because we didn't disaggregate our data. And if we don't act now and change this, then when will we? Later? Change starts in the classroom, through upskilling and education, teaching disability history, ageism, ableism, and supporting the older generation. Opening up new job markets for older people to thrive, to help with digital literacy, giving them new purpose which helps them survive. It's about supporting the longevity dividend, but looking at it with an intersectional lens. We are failing those groups protected by the Equality Act, so here's some things we need to unpack. How do we challenge and change misconceptions? It starts with you and realising your ableist and ageist perceptions. It's about celebrating how disabled and older people make the workforce bright, realising our stereotypes are harming others and sending back our human rights. The future of ageing has already begun, so it's time to make a change and act fast. Call out discrimination from the beginning and make ageism and ableism a memory of the past. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sophia. That was really fantastic. I'm absolutely delighted, Barbara, that you've made it in time. Well done. If you'd like to come up and talk to us all here, you don't need your mic. There's a mic up on the lectern. Sorry, it's a long route, isn't it? You're right.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Barbara Burton. First and foremost, we've covered some of the subjects that I'm going to be talking about. BAME, hard of hearing, I have glaucoma, I've been to prison, I'm starting a new venture, and I'm 65 years old. Thank you. The introduction that I'm quite proud of, believe it or not, is that at the age of 55, I found myself in prison, serving 12 months in 4 different prisons. And from that, I actually saw a completely different, I have a completely different look on life, because the majority of people were split between very young and very old. And when we call old, we're talking a woman over the age of 50 years old. The reason why I started up my company is because I saw that there were women in there that were teachers. There was women in there that were politicians. There were women in there that, for reasons of that we don't know, were actually in prison and thought that that was the end of their life. And I'm using that 12 months to say this is actually the beginning of my life. So as a grandmother who is now considered to be retiring next year, I am going to start up a lingerie business specifically for those that I don't know how to explain it, but literally attracting a completely different age group and a different sizes. So it's quite interesting that, as I said, my colleagues talked about different things to do with age, and I am labelled as a person with multiple disadvantages. I am black, very obvious. I am old, so they say. Completely different, I hope, that I'm able to do what the young people do, and that is to start a new business. I run 7 miles every day before I get up, and I just before I get up, before I go and start working. And I'm trying to prove that my age has nothing to do with what I want to do in my life. I am able to converse with the younger generation. I am able to, I set up my own website and I did it myself without any help. So in other words, I am not on the shelf, and we have got to consider as a group that, be it my grey hairs are now dyed, that it's not necessarily that my age is a hindrance. So that's all I want to really talk about, and that is that what you see is not necessarily what we expect. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Kate, I think, unfortunately, I'm not sure we're going to have time enough for questions, but maybe one or two. So if you do have any, do put them up on Slido. Kate, over to you.
Hi, everyone. It's really lovely to be with you. When I start to talk, I generally then bring the baggage from having worked in ageing for a very long time and done lots of different projects, thinking about lots of different things and far too many thoughts. But I think the thing I wanted to say, thinking when I came, and the panel already have illustrated this, is that fundamentally, if you think you know what an older person is, I can guarantee you that you are wrong. And for me, I think the really important thing to recognise is the story of our ageing society is a story of difference. Because by the time we age, and as we age, the differences of our lifetime amplify and layer on top of one another. And I think when we talk about the differences of an ageing society, there are some big shifts that we can see in terms of how much more diverse our older population is and is becoming and will continue to be. We will see more older people from ethnic minorities in our communities, up and down our communities. There will be more older LGBTQ+ people living openly. And within that group, a huge diversity, as Nancy says, of life histories, a huge diversity of experiences that have got people to where they are. More older disabled people and more people living with long-term conditions, and not just conditions that were acquired in later life, but also conditions that people have aged with or are aging with for the first time. So older people with HIV, older people with learning disabilities. But beyond those characteristics, there is also much, much more diversity, and there are characteristics that we erase when we think we know what an older person is. And, you know, the one that I think is always worth mentioning is the group of older people ageing without children, who we know are so often erased from our policy and planning. So I think the story of ageing is a story of difference, but it's not just about the diversity of the population, it's also about the differences of experiences, those inequalities of experiences. So, you know, we've already talked about gaps in healthy life expectancy, but the experience of living with a long-term condition that comes on and becomes multiple conditions in your earlier life is considerably different when you acquire conditions later in life. Also, the places that we live matter. So aging in a rural or coastal community where older people are in the majority significantly is very, very different to aging in an urban centre where still the population is relatively younger. And it's different again to aging in that sort of middle ground of England, the middle bits of England where actually we're in a middling position in aging. And those places matter to the differences that we have inherently as well. So the older Bangladeshi woman aging in Leeds faces a very different later life to the older Bangladeshi woman I spoke to in Somerset, who has been one of a very noticeable minority all through her life and is now aging without a single other woman of her age and background that she knows around her. The older gay man who's aging in Manchester has a very different experience to the older gay man I spoke to who is aging in rural Yorkshire and whose local friends are dispersed over 200 miles, which was kind of fine until the pandemic hit. And now his life is hugely isolated. The older retiree that I spoke to living with his wife by the seaside is having a very different later life to the older single man who was living in poverty and was moved by his local authority to an HMO in a former hotel by the coast and is now aging in completely unsuitable accommodation with no access to informal support. And those are the differences that we tend to erase when we think we know what older people are like, and those are the differences that really matter to policy and practice. Because when we think we know what older people are like, we make terrible policy, we make really bad services, we practice poor delivery to older people. And I think most of us in this room probably think we know better. I think we know that the older population is really diverse, but the policy and practice that we're still building makes liars of us, because so often they're built around a white, straight, cis, married, no messy pensions on divorce, 2.4 children waiting in the wings to care. We're failing to respond to the older people in reality. And fixing this is probably a lifetime's work. But I've just one suggestion about where we could start. And I do mean this is the start because it's definitely not the finish, but I just think that when we start to think about policy, practice, delivery, services for older adults, if we could just persuade ourselves to think of older people as us rather than them, we'd be making a start. Because if we make policy, even for the older people that we know, or often in many cases we are, we know already that the policy we're making just doesn't work because people are divorced, people are living with dementia, they're aging on their own. If we can't make policy right for the people that we know and we are, then we're definitely not going to get it right for the real rich and diverse older adults that we see and that we will continue to see. So that suggestion won't get us all the way there, but maybe it's a start.
Thank you so much, Kate, for a fantastic summary of what we've heard from all our brilliant panellists today. We have technically run out of time, but I'm afraid I'm going to squeeze a little bit more to ask a question that I really want to of each of the panellists, and it's the same question to all of you. What is the one thing you would like to see change about perceptions or policy, or whatever you choose, in terms of our approach towards the diversity and inclusivity of ageing? Nancy.
Is this working? Oh, great. I'm going to resist the urge to say two things. I don't think that anybody providing care, whether in someone's own home or in residential settings, should be allowed to do that without some basic inclusivity training about LGBTQ elders. The stories we hear about our elders are horrifying. So kind of initiatives like Pride in Care and Pride in Practice, NHS rainbow badges are all part of addressing that. But I think if you can't even say who we are, you're not ever going to be a positive part of our lives. So I think the very basics.
Thank you. Lydia.
Thank you. Just actually around what you have said as well, because training awareness is number one. And why? It's because people who are hard of hearing in later life they will not know what to ask for. They will not know what exists for them. And this is an important point. If you are born deaf, you have been brought up through all the support system. You know what to ask for. And talking about it, trying to talk about it is not enough. We need to practice what we preach. And that comes with a proper training. Thank you.
Thank you. Sophia?
Yeah, I would say I think one of the biggest challenges is around education and making sure if we're looking at prevention, we're actually looking at how prevention relates to the classroom. So having lessons or some kind of education and material around what ageism is, what ableism is, and making sure that young people understand what a disability looks like, that a disabled person can look like anyone, and that their perceptions of disability are impacting their perceptions of older people and basically vice versa. So I think it starts at education at basically the earliest possible stage, because otherwise it's manifest into this systemic ageism that incorporates into every kind of sector and system. And if we don't challenge it at the very earliest stage, then I think that's one of the key things that kind of needs to be improved upon and will kind of help the situation as it stands and the future of ageing.
Thank you. Barbara, what's your one thing? You need to speak into your mic.
I thought I had a loud enough voice. I would say education. Yeah, I would say education, and somehow to use the senior people, older people, as mentors. To, in other words, introduce them right the way into the beginning in schools. Call upon the community and use them as mentors, as I said. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Kate?
Oh, gosh, wow. So I think involvement is a really important thing. You know, involving the people that you're trying to make policy for is always the right answer. But I am incredibly frustrated that we do have, as was said earlier today, legislation on the statute book against age discrimination across goods, facilities and services and in the workplace, and we are not pursuing litigation to make that stick. So for me, we need to do more on the intersections between discrimination, but we can make a lot of a start by just enforcing the legislation that we already have in place.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm really sorry that we haven't had more time for questions from all of you, but I hope you'll join me in thanking this extraordinary group of people for such an insight.
Thank you so much. As I said at the beginning, I'm going to make the comments in English so that we can have the flow, and that may help also for the translators to carry on with their very important jobs. We had a fantastic session that started showing the diversity and how heterogeneous aging can be. We started looking at LGBT issues, and LGBT people that get older become more vulnerable, more prone to homophobia and transphobic attitudes. And in particular, the speaker has highlighted the importance of loneliness. We then looked at deafness as one example of a disability that increases with aging, and how hearing can be another complicating factor that people with deficits in their hearings may face. It is an example of a disability. It could be hearing, it could be vision, it could be many different mobility problems. But the importance that Lydia has called attention is the accessibility to services and devices that can make all the difference, and how in an unequal world, somebody with the same hearing problem may experience a completely different quality of life if that person will or not have access to these services and facilities. And the third speaker, Sophia, has brought the question of discrimination on the basis of functional capacity. This is a new concept. We're talking more and more about ableism, capacitismo in Portuguese, and how they can overlap. And as you grow older, you may also face discrimination on the basis of the deficits, the disabilities that you may have in terms of your functional capacity, and how you can respond to that with two different paradigms, a biological one, medical one, and a social paradigm, because of course poverty in all countries will make things so much more difficult, and she has given important numbers of poverty in older age in this country, in the United Kingdom. We then had Barbara, and I think that I can sum up what she said, saying that what you see is not necessarily what you expect. There she is, old, black, having spent considerable time in prisons, and yet this is a woman that is contributing to demolish stereotypes of what you could expect from a black older woman with a past in jail, in prison. And finally, we had Kate, bringing again, right at the beginning, we talked about the diversity and inequalities, but she has brought the light on inequalities of experiences, a life course accumulation of disadvantages, including where you live, the difference that if you live in a certain setting, and she has given the example of a Bangladesh woman that would live in an area where she would have made social capital, as opposed to a Bangladesh older woman that would have spent her life in a very posh area in southern England, but will face old age in isolation because she doesn't have anybody like her as social capital. And then the chair asked for all the speakers to sum up with a take-home message. And it is extraordinary that all of them mention education, training, awareness. So this is the response to the inequality, the diversity in older age, that if we don't put more emphasis on training, and I just give an example of what ILC Brazil has done in association with the Brazilian Society of Gerontology and Geriatric Medicine. We have produced a book that is unique, so much so that SAGE, the New York-based non-governmental organization, has translated into English, because it's not about LGBT issues at large. It is directed to the health professionals that need to bring more awareness when they are dealing with LGBT and older people. So thank you so much for this very important first session. Let us go to the second, which is incredibly important, as we are going to talk about ageism.
So my name's Sally Greengross, and I know lots of you, but for the people who don't know me, I've been in this aging business for many, many years, and I head up and started the ILC. And a little while ago, I was invited to Australia. That was lovely. Half my family were there, lots of friends, lots of people I met. And it was a great treat because I got taken to lots of places in Australia and met so many people, and always feel I'm related to everyone when I go there. And it was a great pleasure. And when I think back to that visit, I'm really always come back to the same thing. There was one person I met there who was so special, and we got on immediately. We became friends, I think, immediately. And we had the same feeling about aging and the aging of society, and what still goes wrong, because older people are a different species to some people, and what needs to change. And I was very lucky because while I was there, I met someone who was sharing platforms with me in many parts of Australia, and we seemed to get on immediately because we thought the same way. And this was Ashton Applethwaite, who's talking to us now. It was such a delight to meet her because she was passionate about discrimination on the grounds of age and how it's half hidden or sometimes totally hidden with words which mean respect or looking up to people who don't deserve to be looked up to, etc. And there's so many excuses and words that are meaningless when we talk about discrimination. And I met somebody there, an American person who became a colleague very quickly. And we immediately got on because we could understand each other. We could talk the same language. We could talk about discrimination and what it meant. And there were no false barriers. And this person was the person I'm going to introduce to you now, Ashton. She was refreshing in everything she said. I thought really looking at age discrimination was not new. What am I going to learn from this person? Well, I learned a huge amount because she says it in a different way. She feels it in a different way. And it was so refreshing to meet her. And we got on immediately, and I hope I can still say we're friends. And I'm so privileged and delighted to be able to introduce her to you today. So she's a campaigner. She goes all over the States and all over the world, just telling us what we're doing wrong and how not to do it wrong in a refreshing, really stimulating, wonderful way. And you're going to hear her now. So it's my enormous pleasure to introduce Ashton Applewhite, who's a friend, who's the best campaigner I know to combat age discrimination. Here she is. Now we're all lucky you've got access to her. Over to you, my love. Hang on, we can't all hear you. Hang on a minute.
It would help if I unmuted myself there. Such an expert. Sally, thank you. Of course you can say we're friends. I wish I could reach out from my screen and give you a giant hug the way I did on that stage 2 years ago before COVID, a lifetime ago. It's a lot more eloquent, your generous introduction, than the one I received a few weeks ago, which was just, Ashton has a lot to say about ageism, which is true. And here's why. Because we are not going to make the most of longer lives in any arena, in the workforce, in healthcare, in our personal well-being, without underlying culture change. And that means a global movement to dismantle ageism, to educate people about it and how to get rid of it. Think for a minute about the women's movement, how it brought voice and visibility to women around the world. The women's movement achieved this by raising awareness of sexism, the fact that women face higher barriers to equal rights than men do. That is how central ageism needs to be to any conversation about reimagining aging in a changing world, the theme of this conference. Ageism is the one form of bias that everyone encounters, young people too. It's any judgment on the basis of age, and this makes it an issue around which we can all rally to tackle the topic of my talk, how to challenge discrimination in an increasingly diverse world. So I have 5 suggestions today. Number 1, question all the hand-wringing. Media coverage of anything related to aging is typically alarmist. Take the proverbial silver tsunami metaphor, which summons a frankly terrifying vision of a giant wave of old people poised on the horizon, ready to suck all the good things out to sea. Like 20th century rhetoric about the yellow peril or the red menace, gray tsunami language justifies prejudice and encourages conflict. And what we're facing is no tsunami. It's a demographic wave that scientists have been tracking for decades, and it's washing over a floodplain, not crashing on some defenseless shore. Or take the oft-repeated statistic, I bet half of you could finish this sentence, that by 2020, the number of people aged 60 and up will outnumber children under 5. Oh no. Another way to look at it is that by 2020, there will be one older person for every child. Far better for children's welfare than the inverse, when birth rates and infant mortality were so much higher. Or take the notion that older people are a drag on the economy, which is untrue and unfair in several ways. The measures of performance are wrong, An enormous amount of productive activity goes uncounted, and millions of olders are denied equal access to jobs, both paid and unpaid. An AARP, that's the big American organization around older people, a study that they recently released estimated that the cost of age discrimination against people aged 50 and up robbed the U.S. economy in 2018 of $850 billion. The cost to the global economy is in the trillions. The ILC just released a series of reports describing this longevity dividend in Germany, France, and Spain. The important role that olders in those countries are playing as workers, carers, and consumers. Blaming aging for the problems that afflict national economies obscures their origins in global capitalism. Capitalism has to divide people in order to exploit workers, including young workers against older ones, and to increase corporate profits. Longevity is not a problem. It is a triumph of public health and modern medicine. The problem is ageism, bias and discrimination on the basis of age. Suggestion number 2, build on what the pandemic exposed. Another example of hand-wringing, the many headlines about the pandemic, how the pandemic made ageism worse. The pandemic didn't make ageism worse. It exposed the discrimination that has been around us all the time, racism and sexism as well. It is public awareness that is on the rise and giving us a historic opportunity to build on that awareness with conferences with themes like this one. Globally, the mortality rate from COVID-19 for older people is around 12% compared to 1% for younger people. Most deaths are bound to be of older people. We are more physically vulnerable, but not in these numbers. The death toll reflects bias, not biology, and not just age bias. Quote, the coronavirus has laid bare the fault lines that have been ignored for decades: inadequate healthcare systems, major gaps in social protection, and the structural inequalities that create differentiated outcomes. That's from an October 2020 report from the World Economic Forum titled COVID and Longer Lives, Combating Ageism and Creating Solutions. Structural inequalities put people at greater risk of dying of COVID than age alone. This is why Black and Latinx and Indigenous Americans of all ages are dying of COVID at much higher rates than white people. Cognitive impairment is not a risk factor for COVID, and yet Americans with intellectual disabilities are far more likely to contract the virus and at least twice as likely to die from it. Ageism and ableism, seeing older and disabled people as less valuable members of society, legitimize their appalling abandonment. Almost 70% of the total global older population lives in lower and middle income countries. Many of them are poor, and poor people age prematurely. Their outcomes vary widely, shaped by socioeconomic status, as well as by variables like race, gender, migration status, and indigenous identification. Those variables have everything to do with who ages well, not to mention who gets to age at all. Challenging discrimination in an increasingly diverse world means naming and overcoming those barriers. Suggestion number 3, hitch age to the intersectional sled. Different forms of oppression, racism, sexism, classism, those barriers again, compound and inform and shape each other. They intersect in ways that are unique in each of our lives. That concept, developed by Kimberly Crenshaw and other Black feminists, is called intersectionality. And more progressive people in our increasingly diverse world are aware of it. All too often, age and ageism is missing from that list of barriers, and we need to change that. For example, just this week, I looked up the definition of microaggression, and I found tons of great examples. Not one involved age, and people say offensive things about age all the damn time. When age is missing, we need to point it out and insist that it be included. If everyone at a meeting is the same age, for example, unless there's a really good reason, point it out. Diversity and inclusion have become a priority for all types of organizations, and yet the vast majority of DEI initiatives still don't address ageism. It's important to value employees who are non-young for the same reason it's important to value employees who are non-white, or non-male, or non-straight, or non-cisgender, and so on. It's a matter of human rights. Companies benefit from having diverse workforces, and age is a criterion for diversity, obviously. If the organizations you work with or have or work for have yet to get the message, deliver it. Insist that they include ageism in mandated unconscious bias training and address it in their hiring, compensation, and promotion policies. Some people, especially younger progressives, which makes me gnash my teeth, seem to think discrimination against olders is somehow less problematic than other forms of prejudice, kind of bias light, as it were. But trying to determine which prejudice does the most damage or which group is the worst off, getting sucked into the oppression Olympics, is counterproductive and divisive. This way of thinking keeps us from uniting against the structures and system that benefit from all forms of prejudice. All discrimination is wrong. There's a wrong-headed tendency at play here, a sort of deep-seated suspicion that supporting one group has to come at the expense of another. But equity is not a zero-sum proposition. Ageism intersects and informs other forms of disadvantage. An older black woman, for example, experiences ageism differently than her white counterparts and racism differently from her Latinx counterparts. When we ignore or overlook what the most marginalized are up against, inequality increases, and that creates barriers to economic growth and collective well-being. When we create circumstances that enable everyone to participate and contribute fully, on the other hand, everyone benefits. Suggestion number 4, connect ageism to public health. Whether population is framed as a blessing or a disaster, your tsunami or your gentle wave, no one wants older people to be sick and cost money. A growing body of fascinating research shows that attitudes towards aging have a measurable effect on how our minds and bodies function. People with fact rather than fear-based attitudes towards aging walk faster, heal quicker, live longer. One finding, I love this study by Becca Levy at Yale, shows that people who associate old age with growth and purpose are less likely to develop dementia, even if they have the gene that predisposes them to the disease. This is why the World Health Organization launched a global campaign to combat ageism in March. That's the actual name, not the name in my fantasies. Because they realized that the biggest obstacle to extending not just lifespan, but health span is ageism between our ears and in the world around us. The WHO's groundbreaking global report on ageism summarizes the best evidence of what ageism is, its causes and effects, and how to prevent and counter it, and includes specific recommendations for governments, the private sector, and civil society. You can find the WHO campaign and also that World Economic Forum paper, many more anti-ageism tools and campaigns on the Old School Clearinghouse. That's oldschool.info, which frankly is easier to navigate than the WHO website. Old School contains hundreds more carefully vetted resources about ageism, and they're all free except the books. The World Health Organization is not acting alone. Last month, the U.S. National Academy of Medicine joined WHO in identifying, quote, aging and ending ageism as urgent issues for our era, unquote. And the Journal of the American Medical Association issued an open call for papers on, quote, enhancing aging and ending ageism. That is as mainstream as the American medical establishment gets, taking a position that borders on the political. They're calling for papers because we need to learn more about ageism in order to inform policy. The WHO has created an interdisciplinary hub on its Decades platform where scholars around the world can learn from each other. So please propose and support research about how ageism, attitudes towards aging affect our health, and encourage scholars and universities to do the same. Suggestion number 4, think about who gets to age successfully, air quotes around the successfully. For much of human history, aging was seen as a natural process largely beyond our control. Enter the successful aging model in the 1980s, which posits something close to the opposite. If we eat right, stay fit, choose well, have a good attitude, stay productive and purposeful, we can craft the old age we want. It's a really appealing idea, and it has become deeply embedded in popular and consumer culture. There's a central irony here. Although successful aging came into being to counter the negative attitude of aging, this hyper-positive way of thinking is in some respects profoundly ageist. Because what aging successfully really means is to continue to look and move like younger versions of ourselves. In effect, to not age. This feeds denial, and age denial is where ageism and ableism, prejudice against people with disabilities, takes root. Healthy behaviors and can-do strategies are terrific, but they cannot hold aging at bay. Cognitive decline is not inevitable, but physical challenges await us all. And the fact is that we age well, not by avoiding disease and incapacity, but by adapting to them. Glossing over these natural transitions makes it all the harder to learn from and adapt to them. It stigmatizes age-related changes. It divides us. What happens when friends become incapacitated, or it happens to us? The biggest problem with this way of thinking about aging is that it overlooks the very important role of socioeconomic class, along with race, gender, and just plain luck in shaping how successfully we age. Everyone can make sensible choices, but barriers like heavy caregiving responsibilities, inadequate health care, neighborhoods with fewer resources, no leisure time, make it more difficult. These barriers are higher for women, people of color, and people with disabilities. We have to lower these barriers if we want the new longevity to be more equitably distributed and supported in this increasingly diverse world. I'm going to wrap up with a quote from poet and activist Audre Lorde. There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't lead single issue lives, unquote. We cannot dismantle ageism without dismantling ableism and racism and sexism and homophobia and all the rest, because these systems of oppression feed and depend on each other. Creating a more equitable world means supporting every struggle for equal rights. That can feel overwhelming. It did to me, until it dawned on me that activism and advocacy are intersectional too. When we confront any prejudice, we chip away at the fear and ignorance that underlie them all. A better world in which to grow old is also a better world in which to be female or queer or have a disability, and so on. In the Paleolithic era, the emergence of a third generation enabled modern humans to flourish. That's when art and music happened. The emergence of 4, even 5 living generations during our lifetimes is another tectonic shift. This longevity is new. The roles and institutions around us were created when lives were shorter, and they have yet to catch up. This gives us an unprecedented opportunity to shape a world that supports people of all ages and to tap into the social and economic capital of millions more healthy, well-educated adults than ever before in history. To take advantage of this longevity dividend, we need to quit the reflexive hand-wringing, challenge the ageist and ableist assumptions that underlie it, and think realistically and imaginatively about how to shape the all-age-friendly, increasingly diverse world we all hope to live long enough to inhabit. Thank you.
Ashton, that was wonderful. I was as inspired as I was when I first met you in Australia. Thank you so much for inspiring all of us. I think this is... Could you hear me?
I can.
You can. Well, thank you so much. It was really special. And I hope I have an opportunity to meet you in person before too long. And in the meantime, I'm sure there are people here who would like to give you some questions which you can answer for us. So can I ask people to tell us what those are? Who would like to start us off? Right, yeah. Somebody over there. Oh, it's Alex. Hello, Alex. Yeah. Thank you. And, you know, I would just add that some of the diseases that you were talking about occur in young people as well, not as frequently, but it's not aging that is the cause of the disease. It's the disease itself, which hits more older people. And I think we have to differentiate that, or we imbalance, in a way, the argument. And so it's terribly important. Somebody wanted to come in. Yes, gentleman there. Oh, we've got to stop.
There are very few actual diseases of old age, as Sally points out. Almost all of them, what we think of, are conditions that we incur earlier on in life, and the consequences simply add up over time.
Ashton, we've run out of time. It's a great pleasure to see you again, even remotely. Thank you so much. As always, you give us a huge amount to think about, and we want to work on what you said, translate anything that needs translating into the society we live in, wherever that is, and to make sure that wherever we are, we're part of this fight for equality of opportunity as well as treatment throughout our lives. So many, many thanks. See you again soon, I hope.
Well, I do hope that you have really enjoyed this session, listening to Ashton. Absolutely fantastic. This is the second time that I hear this presentation today, and it's just precious. And I think that you can revisit, because this tape will be in the YouTube. In 20 minutes, she has packed so much knowledge and so much insight of what it is, basically what I would say the ideology of oppression, supremacy. It could be young against older people. It could be men against women. It could be able bodies against those that have declining functional capacity, ableism. It could be race. Whatever ideology that will make you think that you are more worth than the other will end up. And what Ashton is fabulous is really to bring together all the different aspects of isms, ableism, ageism, racism, sexism, and so on. She has also called attention to the importance of language. She has given the example. There are people, including in Brazil, that make this association of population aging with a tsunami. There is nothing more destructive than a tsunami. There is nothing positive about a tsunami. Why to call population aging a tsunami if there is absolutely nothing positive? And she has given examples that because of this discrimination, because of this prejudice, the AARP, the American Association of Retired People, has done a study calculating that the United States alone loses $850 billion a year because it's not tapping on the contribution that older people can make in their societies. Obviously, all this is complicated, and as this pandemic has shown, the pandemic has only exposed what we had known for decades: ageism, racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination. But when we bring them together, when there is a superimposition of all these forms of discrimination, the result for those that live, especially those that live in poorer conditions with all inequalities, it is devastating. She has talked about the barriers, and to compound this and shape the intersectionality, we have to get deeper into the causes that are there before the problems will eclode. Discussion and inclusion will have to include different forms and different ways to fight ageism. And she has also pointed out the importance of connecting ageism with public health. Attitudes impact the way we age. We need disaggregation of data, as we also need to educate the providers of services so that increasingly we can dismantle this structural ageism that is there. Very interestingly, Ashton has also brought the paradigm of the 1980s when there were lots of people, very eminent people, talking about successful aging. successful aging. It would immediately give the message for those that were not aging successfully, there was something wrong with them. It could be to do with lifestyle, with choices, not investing enough. So all that enthusiasm for successful aging ended up in a form of ageism in itself. I think that this is very much related to Simone de Beauvoir, who had called attention in her fabulous textbook, Old Age, the importance of resignification of old age. Don't try to be in older age, an older version of your youth. And these were the final comments that Ashton so well has posed. And then she responded to my provocation, my question. Old age is not a disease. And she feels as passionate as I feel that we have to get this message across to WHO. We are not going to accept that on 1st of January, the International Classification of Diseases will have old age as a possible code. So let us go to the next session, which is going to bring Elizabeth White, and you will see also how fabulous the message that she has brought.
Good afternoon again, everybody. I'm hoping that we will be joined by Elizabeth. Elizabeth, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Or good morning from you.
Yes.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've been having various themes today about our speakers challenging the issues and challenging our preconceptions, but then as well as that also providing some solutions. So I'm delighted to welcome Elizabeth with us this afternoon. Elizabeth is an author and an ageing solutions advocate, and Elizabeth was in a position where she found herself trying to get back into the labour market aged 55 and had all sorts of challenges with that, and on the back of that she wrote a book, 55 Underemployed and Faking Normal, where she explored her experiences and provided some solutions in that as well. So Elizabeth, fantastic that you can join us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paul. Good afternoon. Workplace age discrimination is rampant, especially if you are over 45. And today I want to talk about how we fight back, not just as individuals impacted by workplace age bias, but to look also at what business and government can do. So let's talk numbers to get some context. About half of the 40 million working Americans over age 50 will at some point be jettisoned from their jobs, fired outright, or forced to resign, jumping before they're pushed. Once pushed out, very few, only 10%, will ever again get jobs commensurate in pay and status with the jobs they left. That older cashier at your local grocer, the ones that looks a little bit out of place, is probably not there because he or she wants to be. And this is not just a U.S. problem. When you look at the long-term unemployed across OECD countries, you will find that 40 to 70% are age 45 and up. Are we to believe that all of these people suddenly became incompetent, that men and women who have worked successfully for decades somehow managed to go off the rails when they turn 50? No. Workplace age discrimination is systemic and real, and the economic precarity many unemployed older workers face has long-term consequences. Thanks to advances in science and medicine, millions residing in upper-income countries are living longer, fitter lives. If you are in reasonably good health at 60, you have a 50% chance of living well into your 90s. This means millions of us are going to need income for decades. It's not like back in 1965 when life expectancy at birth was 70. You retired at 65 and you had just a few years left to support yourself. Today, you have decades, and this is a huge paradigm shift. Truth is, a lot of older adults have not set aside enough to maintain their standard of living for all those years. Labor economist Teresa Ghilarducci projects that half of Americans turning 55 will face poverty or near poverty conditions by the time they reach 65. Longer lives and smaller nest eggs mean that millions of older adults are looking for ways to remain employable longer. Yes, they want to work, but a lot of them have to work. So what's the play when 6 out of 10 older workers say they've experienced workplace age discrimination? How do we fight back? We're going to have to get angrier. So many who write me, men and women, blue collar and white collar, in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, who've been unemployed or underemployed for months and years, write to me about their shame, about being embarrassed, how friends and family don't understand why they are still out of work. Many are hiding, isolated, and silent. We live in a culture that prizes bootstrap ingenuity, independence, and individualism. So if you're out of work, it must be your fault. Well, this silence and shame have a cost. It means that safety net programs that could help the most vulnerable among us are being shredded, in part because we're not there to demand that policymakers and institutions prioritize what matters to us. We think we're alone, but we're not. The truth is we have the numbers, the clout. The plus 50 segment in the U.S. of the U.S. population is comprised of some 117 million adults. But we can't fight one by one. We need a way to unite, to use our voices to carry this fight forward. So when I was thinking about what we as individuals can do, I was thrilled to learn that noted environmentalist, author, and educator Bill McKibben was launching the Third Act, a grassroots movement to mobilize people over age 60 to push for the changes that must be made in Washington and Wall Street to protect our planet and society. I'm excited about Third Act as an opportunity to mobilize from the ground up, to support campaigns that reframe how we think about aging, longevity, and retirement security, to challenge assumptions about older adults and work. Finding our voices, speaking out, voting our values and our pocketbooks are some of the things we can do as individuals, but many of us will also need training to acquire new in-demand skills for the jobs of the future. On this score, I'm excited about Generation, McKinsey & Company's philanthropic initiative to build employment opportunities globally. Operating in 16 countries, including the US, UK, and Brazil, Generation understands the challenges that older workers face. We need more programs like Generation that provide free job training, placement, and support with special programs for unemployed and underemployed workers over age 45. And of course, business also has a critical role to play if we are to win the fight against workplace age discrimination. We see uneven progress, with some businesses appearing to be stuck in a kind of time warp and others making strides, doing things like scrutinizing job adverts for hidden age bias in the language, expanding their CV screens so that the algorithm does not automatically kick out older workers, calling for more demonstration-based interviews, and offering more flexible work options. But the biggest thing remains prioritizing the fight against workplace age discrimination. It's not that the case against it has not been made. We know what workplace age discrimination costs in lost productivity. AARP and others have quantified the benefit of a no age bias economy. There are always going to be laggards, companies that will never be convinced. Nothing new here. We have had to overcome foot dragging on making progress on women and racial minorities in the workplace too. We persevered there as we will with workplace age bias. Last year, AARP interviewed some 6,000 employers from around the world, and the vast majority, 83%, said that age-diverse workforce was, quote, key to growth and long-term success of their companies. But only 40% actually track age as a diversity factor. This was puzzling to me. If you're not measuring, what are you really doing? Collecting and analyzing data is the first step in understanding workforce age demographics and identifying underlying issues. It is hard to leverage what you don't track. I'm interested in the 47% of companies who are tracking. These companies are the ones that will set the standard and pioneer best practice for how to retain and reintegrate people over 50 back into the workforce. We should be figuring out how to give them a bigger megaphone, convene them, and learn from their experience. But what if we went bolder? Since 2012, Larry Fink, chairman and CEO of BlackRock, the world's largest investment management firm with assets under management of over $9 trillion, has sent an annual letter to business leaders about the most pressing issues facing society and the role of business in addressing them. This year and last, he spoke about the growing retirement income crisis, stating, quote, nearly all countries are confronting greater longevity and how to pay for it. He went on to say, this lack of preparedness for retirement is fueling enormous anxiety, fear, undermining productivity in the workplace, and amplifying populism in the political sphere. In response, companies must embrace a greater responsibility to help workers navigate retirement, lending their capacity for innovation to solve this immense global challenge. I maintain that a big part of helping workers navigate retirement is addressing age bias in the workplace. As the world's most powerful investor, what BlackRock prioritizes reverberates in executive suites and boardrooms around the globe. I believe the fight against workplace age bias would be taken more seriously if BlackRock were to begin engaging corporations on their progress investing in and leveraging the talent of older, experienced workers as a source of competitive advantage. Business is critical for other reasons, too. The economics of aging will force many of us to live more frugally, to redefine what is enough. Beyond healthcare, to the extent that business thinks about older adults at all, it's often to focus on affluent boomers and their need for luxury housing, entertainment, travel, and the like. But what about the vast middle of older adults who need more than pill dispensers and walkers? Where are the affordable products and services for them? The plus 50 market in the U.S. spends some $8 trillion annually. It means something when part of a segment this size starts pumping the brakes on its spending. As a 57-year-old woman wrote me, if I am out of work, I don't have to eat out, buy clothes, or go on vacation. And finally, government. has a big role in fighting workplace age discrimination too. Of course, we need laws that would prohibit it, but I think there is more that could be done. My father was a career officer in the Army, and I remember him telling me how President Harry S. Truman, under pressure from Black civil rights groups, ended segregation in the military and the federal government. That single act in the realm of social and economic justice had a huge ripple effect, catapulting the civil rights movement in the U.S. into the mainstream. The U.S. government in fiscal year 2020 spent $665 billion on contracts. What if age were a factor in how contracts are awarded? What if two bids being equal, the one with a more comprehensive, robust plus 50 strategy, the one that through metrics could talk about what it is doing to attract, retain, and leverage older talent, what if that is the one that won the bid? We factor for women, for racial minorities, why not for age? And I believe that employers and employment support providers who receive federal dollars should be mandated to prioritize the needs of older workers as much as younger ones. These are the kinds of things I believe individuals, business, and government can do to advance the fight against workplace age discrimination. Thank you.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, we don't have any time for any questions, but a couple of reflections from me. I think the statistics you mentioned at the beginning were quite shocking. But I mean, the fight against work.
Again, I think that what Elizabeth White has exposed to us is so strong, and I invite you to listen again what this woman had to say, because so often it is when you personalize a story, when you talk about your experience, in this case, a Black woman, aged 55, and what she had to go through in order to get back into the job market. And the result is a book that is incredibly insightful and full of lessons for us to reflect about what it is to get older and to prove yourself. It reminds us what Barbara Burton had said at the previous session, the very first session that we had today. What you see is not necessarily what you expect. And to overcome this expectation from society, that if you are a female, if you're Black, if you're old, if you don't have full capacity, you have to double your effort, triple your effort in order to convince the others that you are worth an opportunity. And she's not alone. She has given us the figures in the United States. She has shown that 45% of American workers under the age of 60 will be pushed out of the job market. So often, this is entirely to do with prejudice, discrimination, including the discrimination that will not provide lifelong learning to someone who is 40 or 45 because it's reckoned to be too old to learn. That is also ageism. And we have to concentrate on ageism when fighting along the life course, because so often it is that person at the age of 45, 50, 55, or even younger that will not be given opportunities to improve the skills that would enable that person to have a longer working life. And it is exactly those people that need to work in order to carry on with a minimal living standard. Elizabeth has also challenged the paradigm that unintentionally Bismarck, back in the 19th century, precisely in 1881, who launched the first model of social security, establishing the age of 60. In fact, when he established, was the age of 70 as retirement age. It was easy. There were so few people that were above that age, and they would live only for another 2-3 years, with conditions for which medicine didn't have anything to do for, couldn't improve, couldn't really do early diagnosis, let alone treatment. So very quickly, that generation would disappear, would die. Then they pushed down the age for retirement, 65, in some countries even younger, and now it is increasing again. Elizabeth has shown that that paradigm doesn't work today, because at that time, only 4 or 5%, even in Germany, would reach the age of 65 or over. And today we have an increasing proportion in some countries. In fact, in 23 countries, it is already over 30% of people that are countries that have a proportion over 30. And by the year 2050, it will double. It will be more than 60 countries. So that paradigm doesn't work anymore, but we have to fight ages with ableism. And this is an increasingly difficult agenda that we have to put together. Elizabeth has made a statement that I find it incredibly powerful. She said, get angrier, get angrier. I think this is important to listen. We cannot be passive. We have to do what Angela Davis has told people to do in relation to racism. It's not enough not to be racist. You have to be anti-racist. Get angrier, protest, denounce, and only together we can overcome all these forms of discrimination. So let us go to the next and final session today, which is going to be looking beyond the horizon, the international debate and what happens next.
Good afternoon. My name is Alex Kalash. I'm the president of the ILC Brazil. And I had the privilege for many years to be the co-president of the ILC Global Alliance with my dear friend, Sally Greengross. So it's wonderful to be back home. I have been to many different sessions, events here. London is also my home place. I divide my time between Brazil and London. And today we are going to wrap up this fantastic event, looking at a more distant horizon. It is challenging because we have very little time. If there is something that is very clear from what we have heard throughout the day, is the how heterogeneous aging is, diversity, the intersectionality of the different aspects related to aging, the importance of life course. We are at the end of our lives, the result of events and choices that we make, but not only choices. It's not blaming the individual for the wrong choices, the opportunities that are or not there. Inequality is increasing throughout the world. The pandemic has revealed this, but also how the interaction of the different prejudices. We have ages, sexism, LGBTs, the homophobia, the racism that is on the increase, all this making aging forever more complex, and I think that the pandemic has revealed this so clearly. And also we have to bear in mind, if we're bringing this into a global context, the speed and the context of aging worldwide, they vary tremendously. I was not programmed to be here. When I was born in Brazil, life expectancy was only 43. Before the pandemic was in 2019, was already 77. So 34 years, extra years, not of old age, but life. Life has been completely turned round in my lifetime. I am the result of the longevity revolution. But all these gains may reverse if we have the wrong attitude, one of which we have already exposed in the session when I asked Ashton, what about WHO decision to make old age equivalent to disease? Does it fit into the decade of healthy aging? Or isn't it a controversy there that we have to think hard about it? Well, we have a fantastic group of 3 individuals, very different. My dear friend Susanna Harding from ILC Singapore. Susanna has been on the forefront of ILC work, the Global Alliance on Gender, especially women, but also contribute tremendously to the debate, especially in the Southeast region, Asian region, where she's from. So hi, Susanna, nice to see you. We also have from Australia, and I believe that I'm not sure if it is going to be video or also in person. Again, a good old friend, James Beckford Saunders, who is the Executive Officer for ILC Australia, but also the Executive Officer for the International Association of Gerontology and Geriatrics for Asia and Oceania region, and CEO of the Australian Association of Gerontology. And finally, we have Jean Asians from AARP, Senior Vice President of Global Thought Leadership. As you know, AARP is the largest non-profit, non-partisan organization in the United States dedicated to empowering people to choose how to live as they age, bringing together the private, the public, and the philanthropic sectors. So we have 3 different views from three different continents, but we could have 20, 30, 50 more, because aging worldwide represents this tremendous diversity. Let's start, Susanna, with you, if I may ask you to bring your views, which is, as I said, focus on aging, gender, especially with a look on women and aging.
Thank you, Alex. Good afternoon, everybody. Sharing with you from Singapore. And sharing about the work of the ILC Global Alliance Gender and Aging Committee. We know that population aging is hardly gender neutral, and therefore when we want to reimagine aging, we really need to use gender lens. Aging women make up significant proportion of the world's population, and their numbers are growing. They outnumber men in older age groups, and this imbalance increases with age. Worldwide, there are some 123 women for every 100 men aged 16 over. Dr. Sarah Carmel from ILC Israel recently published a study where she found that national and international comparisons indicate that women have an advantage over men in life expectancy, but they are disadvantaged in almost all dimensions of quality of life related to health, functioning, and subjective well-being. Furthermore, among current cohorts of older adults, women suffer more than men from disability, loneliness, and depression. The ILC Global Alliance Committee on Gender and Aging commits to gender equality throughout the life course by ensuring gender is mainstreamed into aging policies and aging is mainstreamed into gender policies. I think this is, when we reimagine aging, we really need to make sure that this intersectionality of gender and aging is right at the heart of any discussion and policy formulation, and then there should be an improvement in the data, in terms of data on this intersectionality. To strengthen the protection of the human rights of older women and to enable them to live in dignity, they merit special attention in the international debate, such as the Generation Equality Forum recently, which was held, organized by UN Women, CEDAW, and highlight not only their struggles, but also their contributions. But one of the things promoting gender equality in aging society should also be broadened to include not just men and women, but the other genders, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer people, LGBTQ. Older adults experience unique economic and health disparities due to a lifetime of unique stressors associated with being a minority, and they may be more vulnerable to neglect and mistreatment in aging care facilities. Everyone, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, deserves equal access to opportunities and services throughout their life course. The second is the disproportionate burden of unpaid care and domestic work of women, which continues to affect their financial security in old age, and this disproportionately impacts developing and rapidly aging countries. Globally, women undertake 76.2% of the total amount of unpaid care work. In the Asia-Pacific region where we belong, women spend 262 minutes per day on unpaid care work compared to only 64 minutes per day by men. And unpaid care work is consistently cited as the main reason for women being outside the labor force. We are penalized for our domestic and care responsibilities in the form of foregone wages and lower earnings resulting from either lower labor force participation rates, interrupted working lives, or different working patterns from men. It is vital for older women and our communities and to the achievement of the SDGs that women's unpaid care work is counted and addressed within the COVID-19 recovery and beyond. The third is that there is opportunities in longevity, and older women's contributions are significant and crucial, and yet they remain invisible. We've seen this time and time again. Their contributions are never acknowledged and therefore not addressed fully. Many older women remain economically active, particularly in low and middle income countries. The ILO estimates that globally 28% of men and 13% of women aged 65 and older participates in the labor force in 2019. In Southeast Asia, a significant number of young old women retire from formal work because of the substantial role they have to play in caring for their children, grandchildren, and for their aging parents. Women are also involved in climate change action. There's a group of older women in Australia, where James is from. They're called the Knitting Nanas. They advocate against unconventional gas mining, other forms of non-sustainable energy for the benefit of the next generation. The contribution of older women to public and private life as leaders in their communities, as entrepreneurs, caregivers, advisors, is invaluable. With women living longer lives, they must be viewed as resources and not a burden. The ILC Global Alliance continues to work in harnessing older women, men, and other genders' potential and contributions towards an inclusive society for all ages. Thank you.
Thanks for keeping the time. We are going to move, now that I'm seeing you, Jean Issues, I am first of all going to ask you up front how to pronounce your name, and then please have the word.
Well, Alex, thank you so much. My name is Gene Axios. I'm extremely honored to be part of this conversation. And what I want to do is just really kind of spend a little bit of time with you, just kind of thinking about exactly where are we today, relative to where we need to be, and what has the last 20 months have really demonstrated to us and taught us with regards to our interdependency, our need for courage, and the need to act as it relates to addressing the many disparities that we see, particularly in health as well as wealth. In January, we start the year 2022. That is about 4 weeks away. Doesn't that sound strange? 2022? I want you to sit with that for a second. It feels like we're moving faster than ever before. It doesn't even feel like it's 2021. It's like we've been living as an extended remix of 2020. In The Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens actually said that this was the best of times and the worst of times. No question the last 20 months have been the worst of times. Over 260 million people have been infected by this virus worldwide, with more than 5.2 million people losing their lives. Here in the United States, hundreds of thousands of businesses closed, never to reopen. Within days and weeks of the pandemic shutdown in March of 2020, millions of people, some of them are friends, some of them are families, if not us, lost our livelihoods. And with the emerging variants and ever-changing guidelines, anxiety and depression are at an all-time high. While we're all weathering the same storm, we're not in the same boat. As COVID-19 spread across the world, two notable developments took hold. First, the pandemic hit older people much faster than other age cohorts. In the United States, 8 in 10 people who died of COVID were age 65 and older. Second, it was also clear that Black, Latino, and Native American people in the United States were being hospitalized, infected, and dying from the virus at a disproportionate rate. We've been through and are going through a lot, but I don't like to say this, but I think it's important. The tough part starts now. When we think about what we've gone through, particularly in our own personal lives, we have to take an honest look in the mirror to recenter and remind ourselves who we are and affirm that things will get better. When the United States and the world looks in that mirror, we can't just have hoped that things will get better. We have to take action to make them better so we can look in that mirror decades from now and not be ashamed. We cannot let what has happened in the last 20 months and counting been in vain. So what is the future we seek? What has this pandemic taught us to inform that future state? When we look back at this point in time, 10, 15, 20 years from now, what is the story you're going to be telling your children, your grandchildren, your neighbors, and your friends? I fundamentally believe, and at AARP, we fundamentally believe that we all as individuals have a capacity to change the world, that we don't have to accept the barrage of bad news and the doom and gloom predictions of our collective future. In order to create a better future, we cannot afford to stand on the sidelines or isolate ourselves from the current realities of the challenges we collectively face. This pandemic has given us, for better or for worse, or in some cases both, an opportunity that is bigger than any one of us, that we have a real chance to reset, to reprioritize and rebuild. However, in order to do so, we need to acknowledge our interdependency, build on the courage that it takes to change, and then act on that change. First, COVID demonstrated in very simple terms that we are interdependent. For decades, many of us have had this false sense of independence. We've forgotten that to be independent, we have to value interdependence or mutual dependence. When you're interdependent, you understand that working together accomplishes more than can be accomplished on one's own, and that those accomplishments set you up for all the things we do on our own to be happy, healthy, and fulfilled. Being interdependent is the only way to achieve and sustain true, lasting independence. It's a win-win that too few people really understand. As a society, as a global community, and as individuals, we must move from independence, which is the attitude of I, to interdependence, which is the attitude of we. Support for our global aging population, particularly in this moment in time, will require a concentrated effort of all sectors, public, private, and nonprofit. Leaders across these sectors play critical roles in providing the leadership and setting the norms necessary to incorporate and amplify the voices of older adults, driving innovation through funding and as well as experimental approaches, and ensuring the high quality of service delivery. In addition to embracing interdependence, we have to acknowledge that it takes courage to build something new. Brian Stevenson said, "You cannot be an effective problem solver from a distance. There are details and nuances to problems that you will miss unless you are close enough to observe those details." When we muster the courage and put ourselves close to the problems, we can much quickly and effectively help those who lost their jobs because they called in sick one too many times because they were caring for an older person or an adult with a chronic, disabling, or serious health condition. Or those who don't get past that first round of job interviews because they're not a quote-unquote cultural fit due to ageism. Those who take 2 buses in an hour-long subway ride to the only job they're told they're qualified for just to make minimum wage, but yet we call them essential workers. Those who ignore aches and pains for far too long because they don't have insurance and end up with a fatal diagnosis no one wants to hear. It takes courage to get close to problems. We have to use this time to get close to the problems by engaging communities fully. We must take the time to listen deeply, to understand what communities want and need, and shift the way we think about those we serve, looking at first at what they actually have rather than what they actually lack, and then being bold and courageous enough to co-create solutions that meet their preferences, goals, and aspirations. If we can't get this right, if we can't let ourselves get close enough to see it, embrace it, solve for it, we lose far more of our humanity and hope for the future. Finally, inaction is a decision we cannot make. Inaction today means that things don't just go back to what they were, they get worse. Inaction means we don't understand or value the independence and interdependence I spoke about earlier today. So in closing, as we think about where we are today, as we think about what we've learned over the course of the last 20 months and the disparities that we see, we need to tell ourselves a new story and then share that story with others. We have a real chance to rewrite the script of a post-COVID global society, a script that is much more better than the first. And everything that we do, and with everything we have an opportunity to really construct a future that is more inclusive, that builds wealth, that strengthens health, and ensures the same economic and educational opportunities that benefits not just the privileged, but those who have historically been marginalized and everyone in between. This isn't just wishful thinking. This is something that can actually happen. But we have to be brave enough to want it, confident enough to plan for it, and proactive enough and courageous enough to make it happen. So with that, let's conduct a comprehensive audit to ensure that policies, practices, and programs that serve older adults are not perpetuating inequalities. Let's ensure the importance of understanding and accounting for the differences of people's beliefs, behaviors, and unique needs. Let's ensure that we're actually putting the systems in place to address the social determinants of health.
Jean, please, I think that your message is very clear. If you could wrap up in less than 30 seconds.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Alex. And then finally, let's do the bold work of putting those who are most vulnerable at the center of our designs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we are going to move to Australia. I was informed that there was a video, so I was expecting that we were going to have a video. And then I looked at the still photograph of James, and he moved. And I said, wow, a video that is moving. Okay, let us have the video, and then James probably will add a few words after the video.
A próxima sessão traz outro aspecto que complementa aquilo que já foi dito. Eu acho que tem problema aqui que está com dois sons. Eu estou me ouvindo e a voz de uma mulher por cima. Vocês estão me ouvindo? Ok. Eu estava com uma voz, talvez da tradução, sem entender muito bem. Deixa eu só chamar a atenção de alguns aspectos que a Suzana deixou muito claro, enfatizando aquilo que já tinha sido dito, em particular pela Ashton, que a pandemia apenas expôs o sexismo, o racismo, o idadismo e outras formas de preconceitos. E o que a Suzana nos trouxe é a importância do... I'm going to turn back to English to be consistent and coherent. It's just that I lost track. Burden of care, the domestic violence. The first to lose their jobs were women that were plunging into informal care and very often to poverty. And yet the invisibility of the contribution of older women. And then we have Jean, and I think that one of the important messages that he has given here is it's like we went to bed in 2019 and suddenly we're waking up in 2022. The world has changed. This pandemic has turned things around. And we have to face the reality and face 2022 and beyond, hopefully, with the pandemic having passed. We don't know yet. And this is the important message that Jean brings to us. We have to learn not to emphasize independence, but interdependence. And he has repeated this so often, interdependence rather than independence, because that is the way for the future, be it within a country, within age groups, or globally, country to country. And he has call attention coming from such a large country like the United States, like mine in Brazil, the superimposition of racism, the aspects to do with gender, social inequalities, and opportunities. And then you are looking at something that is painful. I'm quite close. I spend a lot of time working in Australia. And what James brought here, being the chair of the Australian Aging Association and also the trustee of the ILC Australia, is the illustration of how different countries, including Australia, including my country, Brazil, including Canada, the United States, how we are treating indigenous populations. Life expectancy for an Aboriginal person in Australia is a good 20 years or more smaller, lower than for the mainstream population. And that was the main message, that again, we have to look at specific groups, however small they may be, because we cannot leave anybody behind. We really have to face this post-pandemic into 2022 and beyond, bringing people together. Let us have the final video, which is the discussion that followed this last session.
It has raised many different questions and points that we would like to raise here, but I'm very aware of the time. It has been a long day. I'm just going to make some few remarks at this very end, because it can't be escaped. The fact that we had here a highlight on the United States, possibly the most unequal of all developed world countries, and me from Brazil, possibly the most unequal of all the developing world. And we combine here, and the pandemic has brought this to the scene in a naked and graphic way, the overlapping of races, ages, sexes, the homophobia, the prejudice against LGBT, all this compounding to the fact that the United States has accumulated 700,000 deaths and Brazil 630,000. Bear in mind that Brazil is much younger and with a smaller population. If we had the same age structure in the United States, we would be over 1 million because of irresponsible government not believing and following fake news. This is catastrophic, and if we are not aware of that, and if we don't put the finger on this wound, we can repeat this experience next year, when there might be another pandemic, because the way we are treating Mother Earth is just inviting other pandemics to come. And the final word about what Jean said. Susanna also, it's important to say that women have suffered because of the burden of care, domestic violence, the first to lose their formal jobs, the informal care in their hands, and the invisibility of their contribution. And then finally, from Australia, another large country, and inequalities that express the fact that older people are not, older Aboriginal population is not increasing. I have just been told, good news, that we have 5 minutes for questions, so please raise your hands. This is the first time that I see an ILC crowd shy. There is a question here. Ken Bluestone, do economic measures such as GP and dependence ratios obscure the contributions and realities of older women and men, and what should be used instead? Susanna, maybe I could ask you to reflect on this. Did you hear well the question? I'll repeat.
I couldn't hear Alex.
Yeah, the essence is the GDP and dependency ratio obscure contributions on realities.
Well, yeah, that has always been the discussion around how to really measure contributions at the national level. But as we know, caregiving, the informal care work, which is unpaid, it's never even been mentioned in any of this national accounting. So I think the starting point is really the recognition that informal, that care work is a contribution, and to monetize it and to really put an amount to it, and then be able to then recognize it and include it into the national accounting of countries in terms of the gross domestic and services contribution of the country. Then we would be in a better position to really say that we are including women and recognizing that they have their own needs, right? So I think that's the main point. So there is a whole discussion around what kind of accounting should we be using. In terms of the dependency, we know that as long as there continues to be societies whereby the natural tendency, the expectation of society is that women will have to be the one to do a lot of the unpaid work, not just the caregiving in terms of the care work, but also household chores and other work that's not that's could be done by somebody else and paid for it. Then that also continues to be a problem. So dependency, a lot of the women will continue to be dependent because they have not worked at all. But even in Singapore, very interestingly, education, the education, they say when women gets more educated, they would be more at work. But we know in Singapore that at a certain age, they actually drop out of the labor force, even the highly educated women. So even the education doesn't mean that women will not get out of the labor force, stop working, and therefore not get counted again in the national productivity as a result.
So can I just add one comment to that?
Yep.
So in the United States, we've done some work looking at the economic contributions of older adults. And what we found was that in 2018, older adults contributed $8.3 trillion in economic activity. And because of the growing aging of the population, that'll come up to about $26.8 trillion in 2050. Another way to kind of think about it is that for every dollar spent in the United States in 2018, 56 cents of every dollar was spent by someone over the age of 50. And that by 2050, that'll be 62 cents of every dollar. Why am I sharing this? Because part of our conversation is looking at ageism, and it's looking at the exclusion of certain populations. When you take into account the cost of ageism, what we found in the United States is that ageism cost the United States $850 billion in 2018. And when you look at the intersectionality of age and gender, what we found was the fact that it disproportionately impacted women, older women. So in other words, ageism actually stifles economic growth. Sexism stifles economic growth. So as we have these conversations, we need to be thinking about how do we really create a more inclusive economy that benefits all populations, all generations, because excluding certain populations actually impacts all of us.
Thank you. I'm again aware of the time. There is something, Ken, that we have to bear in mind here. GNP in itself doesn't say anything. We come from a country like Brazil that has seen the GNP increasing last year, and yet the inequalities. 56% of the population in Brazil live with food insecurity, and Brazil is the first or second food producer in the world, feeding pigs in China, but incapable to feed the people there. We have created 97 billionaires in Brazil. So if you only measure on the amount of wealth that has been generated, we are not really addressing the inequalities. And this is the big challenge for a fast-aging population here or in the developing world. There is an anonymous question that I will actually ask Martin to address, if I may, because it is, how can the ILC Global Alliance work together to influence change on a local level? And if Sally would be here, can see Sally here, there is no question that she would raise and say, we have to work to have an ILC with a global range. it cannot be the sum of what we do in 16 different countries, but really what ILC-UK has just pushed to create an ILC for Europe in the same way that Brazil and Argentina are now creating an alliance that would be Ibero-American, Spain, Portugal, and Latin American countries with more cultural affinity. And the very last point that I would like to make, which is what Nicola Acton from Age-UK Sutton, a lot of fascinating and at times conflicting insights today about challenges. Can the panel offer one concrete action we can do in 2022 to make things better? That will be one action. So it is going to be a very fast 15-second action from the two of you. What could be done better in 2022 to create a better place in the world to age?
Well, for me, I think it's when we talk about having Generation Equality Forum, review of the MIPA, we need to have more older women in the table rather than to make sure that the representations is there. It's never going to be
Plan
able
of Action
to.
on Aging, if we are not familiar. Okay, Susanna. Jean, please.
For me, I think the key to addressing inequities is data. I think we need to strengthen data collection, analysis, and reporting. I think it's critically important to disaggregate the data by demographic variables like race and ethnicity and accounting for intersectionality or overlapping identities. I think it's critically important for the purposes of refining existing programs and helping to inform expansion and replicating and adopting new initiatives.
Agree. James.
And I would say, of course, data coming from a gerontological and a life course approach, but from what we've learned, it's the issue of power, that the power transfer and having conversations with people, giving equal power, and in fact letting go and getting out of the way so that that power can really show its strength. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been looking after this land for 60,000 plus years, and there's so much to learn, and it's a very different worldview where things like GDP just don't come onto the horizon.
Thank you, James. And if we're talking about distributing power, we're talking about gender inequality, we are talking about sex, race, and of course, in countries like Brazil, the United States, Canada, and so on, the Aboriginal, the indigenous population that has so much suffered with the pandemic. Martin, I think that I have to hand to you to close, bring your final remarks and that question that I have asked you, so you'll have a challenge. I will definitely address it.
Well, we are getting close to the end of this 5th session of the International Longevity Forum. We have learned a lot. I invite you to listen again to this video, watch it again, because there is so much knowledge compacted there. But there are final messages that I think James has encapsulated when he has brought the idea of empowerment. It is to empower us, so the people, as we age further. It's to empower the minorities, so-called, be them related to sex, to race, to functional capacity, so that we would have a better chance to get older, especially those that have already accumulated disadvantage throughout life, so that we can face it 2022 better than we were at the beginning of 2020 with the catastrophic impact, the pandemic, which is not over. And that is important also as a message. It's not over. And we have to learn lessons from this pandemic to possibly face other pandemics that may be on their way. Maybe for 2022, the dream would be to create an age-friendly world. When I was the director of the World Health Organization, we launched what is the age-friendly cities and communities. We needed that example and that model, and has grown. We have thousands of cities and communities and villages of all sizes that are following what we had envisaged in 2005 to 2007 when the study following the same methodology and based on the active aging policy framework has given us a vision for the future. I think that the vision for the future, nearly 20 years later, has to be to create a much broader ecosystem age-friendly. It's not only the city. It has to bring together the health system, the social system, so that people can feel secure as they age. It's to bring, and we had a session today here with Elizabeth White, the future of jobs, the future of gender, the opportunities for women, to combat ageism and ableism. All these things converge into an ecosystem. And in fact, there are groups, and I'm privileged to be a co-director of the Boston Age-Friendly Institute, which got a very important grant from John Hart for Foundation through Terry Fulmer, who is a champion on this idea of creating an age-friendly ecosystem that would bring and encapsulate a world in which it's better for you, whatever your age, to grow older, feeling more security with better quality of life. Well, we are now closing the 5th session of the International Longevity Forum, and I will just say the final words in Português. Obrigado pela atenção. Sei que foi dia longo, certamente para mim, porque eu estou neste fórum desde hoje cedo aqui em Londres, mas aprendi muito. E eu convido e reforço o convite para vocês olharem de novo no YouTube essa sessão que foi extremamente rica em aprendizagem, com excelentes palestrantes de alcance internacional, mas sempre com uma mensagem consistente. E uma das mensagens consistentes que foram trazidas aqui é que sem mais educação, sem mais training, sem mais aprendizagem ao longo da vida, para todos nós, desde o mais básico empregado, operário, até o CEO mais importante da companhia mais importante, nós não vamos realmente fazer da revolução da longevidade uma experiência de sucesso. Até a próxima semana, quando nós fecharemos o Fórum Internacional com uma mensagem importante: como desenvolver uma cultura do cuidado. Até a próxima semana, às 5 horas aqui.
Pensou no futuro, pensou no presente. Lembrou que pode sempre contar com a gente. Bradesco Seguros, com você, sempre com você. Futuro.